This podcast is sponsored by ebookit.com, self-publishing solutions for the independent author and small press. Visit us today at ebookit.com.
Welcome to the Toastmasters Podcast, the official podcast of Toastmasters International. Hello, everyone. This is Greg Gazin. What we've got here is a failure to communicate. That's a famous line spoken by the captain in the movie Cool Hand Luke back in 1967. Poor communication is not necessarily simply because what we're saying isn't clear or too complicated or not simple enough, but rather, according to our guest today, Charles Duhigg, we're having different kinds of conversations. Now, today, Charles will enlighten us on how we can identify and tune in to the right conversation and highlight key ways we can enhance our communication skills and show us how anyone can be a super communicator. Our guest is Charles Duhigg. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter and the author of 3 best-selling books, The Power of Habit, which spent over 3 years on the New York Times bestseller lists, Smarter, Faster, Better, and his latest book, Supercommunicators, How to Unlock the Secret Language of Connection, was published this past February. Charles is a graduate of Yale University and Harvard Business School. He's been a frequent contributor to This American Life, NPR, the Colbert Report, PBS's NewsHour, and Frontline. Charles currently writes for the New Yorker magazine and is also the author of the article in the July 2024 issue of the Toastmaster magazine entitled Strengthen Your Conversation Skills, Enhance Your Communication Skills for Better Relationships. Coming us today from Santa Cruz, California, where he lives with his wife and 2 children, Charles Duhigg, welcome to the Toastmasters Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I'm excited for this conversation.
Me too.
I've read both the article and, of course, your book. And what I found fascinating is that you talk about the science of communication, but rather than this complex, dry, academic delivery style, you have stories and examples that range from CIA recruitment to dating and falling into a bad pattern with your wife.
Yeah.
So to kick us off, Charles, can you please tell us a little bit about the book and what was it that motivated you to write this book?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And actually, it started because of this bad pattern I fell into with my wife. Yeah. We had been married about 20 years, and I got into this pattern where I'd come home and I would start complaining about my day. And my wife very reasonably would offer me some advice like, oh, why don't you take your boss out to lunch and you guys can get to know each other a little bit better? And instead of being able to hear what she was saying to me, I would get even more upset. And I would say, why aren't you on my side? And you should be supporting me and be outraged on my behalf. And then she would get upset because I was criticizing her for giving me perfectly good advice. And so one day I decided to go to psychologists, to researchers who study communication and ask them, what's going on? Why do I keep falling into this pattern? Particularly since I'm a journalist, I'm supposed to be a good communicator. And they said, well, we're actually glad you came by because we're living through this golden age of understanding communication for really the first time. Because of advances in neural imaging and data collection, we really know what's happening inside your brain when you talk to another person. And what we've discovered is that people tend to think when they're having a discussion that the discussion is about one thing, right? We're talking about my day or our kids' grades or where we should go on vacation next year. But actually, they said, every discussion is made up of different kinds of conversations. And in general, those kinds of conversations, they tend to fall into one of 3 buckets. There are these practical conversations where we're solving problems together. And then there are emotional conversations where I might tell you how I'm feeling, and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize and relate to me. And then there's social conversations, which is about how we relate to each other in society and the social identities that are important to us. And they said, what we've discovered is all those different kinds of conversations are all equally legitimate. But if you're not having the same kind of conversation at the same moment as the person or the group that you're speaking to, then you will not be able to connect with each other. You won't be able to fully hear each other. And that's, of course, exactly what was going on with my wife and myself. I was having an emotional conversation about my day. She was responding with a practical conversation with suggestions. And as a result, we really couldn't hear each other. We couldn't connect. But they said, if you manage to figure out what kind of conversation is happening, and have the same kind of conversation at the same moment, then you can connect with each other. You can understand each other. You feel what's known as neural entrainment. And that feels marvelous. That feels wonderful. And that's when you have a real conversation. And this has become known within psychology as the matching principle.
Interesting. Before we get into the matching principle, how can we learn to recognize what kind of conversation is occurring? Because I mean, we're there right in the moment, right? You get home, you're talking to your wife, and it's like, is there some kind of a technique that you use? I mean, how can you quickly switch? Okay, what kind of conversation are we having today?
Yeah. So part of it is simply like in the back of your mind, just being aware of asking the question, right? Like, does this person seem like they're in an emotional mindset or a practical mindset or a social mindset? Once you just learn to ask yourself that, it becomes very, very intuitive. But the other thing that you can do is you can ask questions. And there's a special kind of question that helps us determine what kind of conversation is occurring. And it's known as a deep question. And a deep question is something that asks about values or beliefs or experiences. And that can sound a little intimidating, right? Like I have to get like really deep with someone. But actually, it's very easy. If you met someone who's a doctor, instead of asking them, oh, where do you practice medicine? Instead of asking them about a fact of their life, if you ask them and said, oh, what made you decide to go to medical school? Or what do you love about being a doctor? Do you like that job? What I'm doing there is I'm asking a deep question, and it doesn't necessarily appear deep, but it invites the other person to talk about their experiences or to talk about their values or their beliefs. And when they do that, inevitably they will tell me something that helps me understand what kind of a mindset they're in and helps me understand what kind of a conversation they're looking for. And at that point, it's easy for me to match them.
So, how do you match? What's the technique?
Yeah. So, let's take an example from a couple of weeks ago. I was at this meeting and I was sitting in a conference room, and we were waiting for the meeting to start and people to come in. And I turned to the guy next to me and I said, how was your weekend? Just trying to make conversation. He said, oh man, it was great. I went to my son's graduation and it was just awesome. What the natural thing to do would be to say, oh, congratulations, that's so great. And then say, okay, let's get down to business. Here's the agenda. But instead, I wanted to match this guy. And I saw he talked about his feelings. He talked about how great it was, how awesome it was. So I said, oh man, that must have been, congratulations. That must have been fantastic. What did it feel like to watch your kid walk across that stage? And for the next 3 minutes, this guy talks about how amazing it felt and that it made him think about his own parents and the advice his parents had given him and how he tried to pass that on to his own kid and this sense of continuation. And it wasn't like, we were crying on each other's shoulders. It wasn't hard. It wasn't awkward. But by asking him an emotional question, how did that feel? It gave him a chance to express himself and for us to match each other. And then I said, wow, that's really powerful. And I remember my graduation and my parents coming to it. And then I said, I guess we should get down to work. Let's I guess start going over the agenda. And during that entire conversation for the next hour, we felt aligned with each other. We felt connected to each other. We liked each other and we're listening to each other. So that's how we match each other, is we listen for those clues about what kind of conversation is happening. And then we just lean in a little bit to the conversation that's occurring.
That's interesting. Actually, day before yesterday, a friend of mine had called to tell me that he had ran into someone that he hadn't seen for a while. And when he had asked, how's his lovely wife doing? The gentleman said, well, she passed away a little while ago. How do you match? How do you listen? How do you respond to that? Are there techniques for that? That comes up a lot.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the thing that often stops us is that we're afraid of saying the wrong thing, right? We're afraid of asking something intrusive or we don't know what to say. And in a situation like that, asking a deep question is the best thing to do. To say, oh, I'm so sorry. Tell me a little bit about her if you don't know her well. Or, oh, I'm so sorry. Like, she was such a special person. I remember the time that I was sick and she really helped me out. How are you doing? How are you feeling? When we ask a deep question, what we're doing is we're inviting, but not mandating, someone to share with us what they're experiencing. And it's important if you say, how did she die? Or what was it like the last couple of days? That's a mandate, right? But if I invite you to share with me if you choose to, I can say things like, how are you doing? Or what was your wife like? Or how are things going? Like, what are you doing now to keep yourself busy? Then I'm inviting you to share with me without mandating it.
So depending on how he or she answers, in this case, he, that will help guide you where the conversation goes next.
Yeah, maybe they say like, oh, I'm doing fine. Thanks so much. Okay, so it's clear they don't want to talk. They don't want to have an emotional conversation right now. They don't want to talk about their wife, and that's totally fine. And it gives me permission to start asking about other things, to not dwell on this topic. But it's just as likely that, when my father passed away 7 years ago, a couple of people asked me, what was your dad like? And it was wonderful. Like, I had been thinking about my dad nonstop for the last 3 weeks. And so in order to share that with someone, to tell them what I'd been thinking about, that felt really, really good. And that's what I think, that's what a deep question can do, is it can invite us to share what we're thinking about without mandating that we share it.
Talking a little bit more about matching in the book, there's a story of the CIA recruiter who isn't doing so well. Could you share a little bit about that story?
Sure. Yeah. So this is a guy named Jim Lawler who, he had always wanted to be part of the CIA, and eventually he gets hired when he's about 30 years old. And they send him over to Europe to recruit overseas assets. And he is just terrible at this job. Like, he tries to recruit people and they're like, look, I don't want to talk to you. I know exactly what you're doing. He's just miserable at it. He can't really connect with anyone. And there's this one woman that he's been trying to recruit for months and months and months. She lives in the Middle East. She works for the foreign ministry of her home government. And she keeps saying no, no, no. And then she actually says, I don't want to see you anymore. Like, I'm really scared about talking to you. And so he convinces her to have one more dinner. And basically during the dinner, he just gives up. And she's really glum because she's about to fly home. And, she'd kind of come to Europe to try and to figure out like how to deal with the fact that the religious radicals had come to power in the country, and how does she live a life that feels meaningful. And he just gives up, and he just starts talking about the fact that he's basically struggling with the same things, right? At first he tries to cheer her up. At first he tries to tell her funny stories and cheer her up and make her feel better, and that's not working. And so then he just kind of gives up, and he's like, look, I understand exactly what you feel like. I have wanted to be in the CIA my whole life, and I finally made it to this job that I wanted, and I'm terrible at it. Like, I'm so bad. I think I'm going to get fired. And he talks about how he's feeling and how disappointed he is in himself. And after about 10 minutes, she starts crying. And then he feels even worse. He says, look, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you cry. Like I'm so sorry. I've screwed this all up. And she says, no, I understand what you're saying now. I think we can help each other. And that's when she decides to become an asset for the CIA, not because he tried to convince her into it, not because he tried to manipulate her, but because he matched her and he was honest. And she ends up becoming one of the best assets in the Middle East over the next 20 years. But it only worked because he matched her.
Yeah. He was vulnerable. Is there a time where we shouldn't be or should be vulnerable?
The goal, I mean, look, if you're having a practical conversation, vulnerability might not help you bond with each other, right? If we're talking about where we're going to go on vacation, and I don't think vulnerability can ever be bad. It's just sometimes it's not useful. So I don't know. I mean, I think that the point is, it's not that some expressions or some emotions are good or bad. It's that we listen closely to what the other person, where their mindset is, and we try and lean into that and invite them to lean into us.
Yeah. I guess you'll also have to be careful too, because sometimes if you overshare, it becomes that Me Too thing. And then all of a sudden you end up taking over the conversation when we're really talking about the other person, right?
Well, right. That's not matching, right? If someone says, how are you doing? Oh, I'm feeling kind of glum. My aunt passed away last week. The wrong thing to say is, oh, I know exactly what you mean. Like, my dog died 7 years ago, and I know exactly what this is like. That's not you trying to lean into them. That's you trying to steal the spotlight for yourself. That's mimicry as opposed to matching. Matching is about trying to show the other person, I want to connect with you. I really hear what you're saying. And when we do that, that's when we start to feel close to each other.
Yeah. Getting back to the questions for a moment, there's something popped into my head as you were speaking. You talked about asking deep questions. And of course, you're a journalist, and I've written articles as well, and an interviewer. How can you ask deep questions without coming across as interrogating or prying?
Well, I think that's where this inviting versus mandating is important. A mandating question, a prying question, is to say, like, when's the last time you cried in front of another person? That the problem is, if I ask that question, there's no way for the other person to sort of gracefully decline, right? They're being mandated to talk about something deep. But if I say, hey, I'm just wondering, like, I know that the last year has been kind of tough. Tell me a little bit about the last year. Like, what's been some good parts of it and what's been some bad parts of it? Or just tell me how you're feeling right now. That's an invitation. Someone can say something like, oh yeah, no, it's been a little bit tough, but I'm doing a lot better now. Okay, they don't want to tell me about their year. That's not the headspace that they're in. It's not something they want to do. But they could also say, oh man, an aunt passed away and it took me a couple of months to really like process that and get over that. But then also one of my cousins got married and it was so nice to see sort of this new love and new life. What's important is when we are asking questions to make them into invitations rather than mandates. And then the nice thing about a deep question is, instead of it being interrogation, instead of me asking you question after question after question, it's very natural to answer our own question. If I ask someone, why'd you decide to go to medical school? And they say, oh, I saw my dad get sick when I was a kid, and that made me want to become a healer. It's very natural to say, oh, that's so interesting. I'm a lawyer, and I became a lawyer because I saw my uncle get arrested when I was a kid, and I thought it was really unjust. So in what I'm doing there is I'm answering the question that I asked, but it doesn't seem like it's obnoxious. It doesn't seem like I asked the question simply to express myself. And that's how we change a conversation from being an interrogation to a back and forth.
Now, in your book, you talk about how NASA chooses astronauts, and they don't necessarily ask questions one would think they would ask.
Well, that's right. So in the early 1980s, NASA had this problem, which is President Ronald Reagan came to them and he said, look, I'd like you to start doing longer missions. I want to build a space station and I want you to do missions of 6 to 12 months at a time. And this was a problem for NASA because up till that point, most of their missions had been 10 days long at the longest. And what they discovered is that you can basically send anyone into space for 10 days and it's going to be fine. If they're a jerk, if they're not good at like emotional intelligence, it's fine. 10 days is just 10 days. But if you start sending people up into space for 6 months or 12 months and they're living next to each other in this small tin can that's surrounded by a vacuum, you really have to start finding people who have emotional intelligence. The problem was that it was hard to find people who were emotionally intelligent because what they found inevitably was that if you make it to the final rounds of an astronaut interview, you're someone who's like, you're good looking or beautiful. You have 2 PhDs. You're really, really impressive. And most importantly, you have been doing interviews your whole life. You know how to fake emotional intelligence really, really well. And they couldn't figure out, how do we tell the people who fake emotional intelligence from the people who are actually emotionally intelligent? And so they turned to this one guy, Jim McGuire, and they asked him Terry McGuire, who is the lead psychologist for manned spaceflight. And they asked him to solve this problem. How do we figure out who has actual emotional intelligence from people who are faking it? He spent like a year working on this problem. And he listened to all these old interviews and he went through all these old records and he tried to figure out, what did people do in interviews who ended up becoming good leaders versus the people who ended up sort of washing out of the program? What he discovered one night as he was listening to these interviews is that the people who became sort of natural leaders, the people who seemed really good at emotional intelligence, they laughed differently than everyone else in their interviews. So he starts this new way of interviewing. Now, when he does an interview, he walks into the room where he's going to interview the candidate and he's carrying a big stack of papers. And as he walks in, he spills the papers as if on accident. And then he laughs this big, boisterous laugh. He goes, ha, 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 ha. I can't believe I did that. And then he pays close attention to how the candidate laughs back. Because everyone knows you're supposed to laugh back, right? And some people would sort of chuckle a little bit. That's really silly. Let me give you a hand with that. Mm-hmm. And other people would laugh, a boisterous laugh themselves. They would go, that's really silly. Let me give you a hand with that. Because what he knew was We've all been in that situation where we make a mistake, like we spill papers walking into a room. And then sometimes we awkwardly compound the mistake by laughing this big laugh, by overreacting. And we're kind of embarrassed a second time for overreacting. And some people, they try and sort of sweep it under the carpet. They try and not share that embarrassment with you. They laugh a little laugh. But some people say, the way to help you is to show you that I want to connect with you, to share your embarrassment, to laugh this big boisterous laugh in response. Those were the people who had emotional intelligence. And those were the ones who ended up being great astronauts.
Mm-hmm. Well, Charles, you've given us a number of golden nuggets. And I'm just wondering, people are thinking, I know I need to be a super communicator. I know I can do it. What should they do to get started?
I mean, the best thing they could do is buy the book, right? The book is all about how to become a super communicator. That's why I wrote it. And then to take the skills that are in that book and practice them, because our brain is designed to take communication skills and make them into habits very, very quickly. So you don't have to practice them very much. But if they identify those skills that allow them to be a super communicator, which is, again, what the whole book is about, and then they practice those skills just a little bit, they will become habits. And anyone can become a super communicator. Anyone can learn to connect with nearly any other person.
Excellent. Now, folks, if you found this valuable, I encourage you to share this episode with your family and friends. You can get the Toastmasters podcast at toastmasterspodcast.com, toastmasters.org, Apple, Spotify, anywhere you get your podcasts. And to wrap things up, Charles, because I know you're on a tight schedule, can you please let us know how people can contact you, where they can get the book, etc.?
Yeah, you can get the book anywhere you buy books, from Amazon or Audible or your local independent bookstore, which is a great place to buy books. And if you want to reach out to me, just Google my name. My website is charlesduhigg.com. And if you Google me, or you Google The Power of Habit, or you Google Super Communicators, I will inevitably come up, and all my contact information is on my site.
Charles Duhigg, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me on the podcast, and wish you all the best with your third book, which I know is already a bestseller.
Thanks for having me.
Ever imagined a book written just for you? Introducing Books.ai. We're not just another bookstore, we're the future of reading. Our state-of-the-art AI adapts each book to your specific needs, creating a personalized masterpiece. Visit Books.ai now, that's POOKS.ai, and use the promotion code SPOTIFY for a whopping 50% off. Books.ai, your personalized book awaits.